All right, in this video installment, we're going to talk about the revolutions of 1848, the springtime of the people, as it's called. They start with great hope that it's going to enact liberal goals and reforms. It's also joined by many of the urban working class peoples. And so these are popular uprisings against really unpopular conservative regimes. You would think that those would lead to long-lasting effects and changes, but actually the revolutions of 1848 are almost all going to be failures that result in very little changes. The only real change we see is in France, which I guess you could debate whether that's a part of the revolutions of 1848 or not anyway, and even that doesn't end up the way that the leaders thought it would. So without further ado, let's get into these oft forgotten revolutions. And the reason why they are oft forgotten is because they're not very successful. So I have filled in some answers to the reading guide that I had made, and we'll just kind of run through those real quickly. And of course, you can always pause or take notes or underline or any of those things that you want to do. All right, so what makes the 1840s so ripe for revolution? Well, there's a lot of stuff going on in Europe in the 1840s, and most of it is pretty bad. And that is going to lead to a lot of turbulence and unhappiness, which are often, the wellspring of revolutions. So first of all, there are a series of terrible harvests that are going to take place in the 1840s. The Irish potato famine is the most famous from an American perspective of these events, but it is not just in Ireland, it is continental wide. In fact, the 1840s are often called the Hungry 40s because a series of catastrophic crop failures lead to terrible harvests that lead to widespread hunger. And of course, I have said over and over in the various classes that I've taught that, revolutions very seldom happen on full stomachs. Number two, there's a lot of economic depression and then government inaction or inability to solve those economic problems. The industrial economies of some places are very sluggish, unemployment is very high, and there is not a lot of safety or social welfare set up to care for people who are the victims of these economic struggles. Now, whether the governments take action because they refuse out of some principled stand, like laissez-faire, you just write it out, or they don't know what to do because they're incompetent, the end result is a lot of people are really upset and lose faith in the governments that are in charge because they do little to nothing to address the economic conditions that are causing so much misery. There is the usual liberal angst in many places where liberal politicians are going to look to gain greater concessions from conservative governments, more representative government, more liberal constitutions, more civic equality, more promises to allow economic freedoms and things like that. And these liberal leaders are often going to align themselves with the working class, even though they have divergent goals. And they will use worker frustrations to help fuel their political ambitions, although this is going to come back to bite them, as we will see. And then last but not least, particularly in the revolutions that take place within the Austrian Empire, within the Habsburg realm, nationalism is going to be a driving force of many of these revolutions that we see take place as well. And so the revolutions of 1848, we're about to get into them. Let's just talk about where they're going to take place. We see uprisings in Paris, France. We see uprisings in Vienna, in Prague, in Hungary, in Italy, in Prussia. Only one results in any sort of significant long-term governmental change, and that will be in France. All the ones that happen in the German lands or in the Habsburg lands will be defeated by the conservative powers that be. They will be shook early, but they will come back with a vengeance. Okay, so let's get into it. So explain how the divergent goals of the French liberals and the French workers imperiled the Second Republic. Well, this is assuming we're jumping ahead a little bit, so let us just get caught up. When last we had talked about France, we had talked about the Revolution of 1830 that sees the ultra-royalist Charles X deposed and the liberal monarchy of Louis Philippe installed. And Louis Philippe represented the desire of many French liberals to create a more liberal government that allows for representation and constitutional reforms that benefit the bourgeoisie, as well as a implementation of free market principles. But Louis Philippe is socially conservative. He is not going to address any of the workers' issues or unrest that exists within French cities. Now, eventually, Louis Philippe's regime that rules for about 18 years will become increasingly unpopular. Liberals will become disgusted at what they see as rampant corruption. They will hold a series of banquets that criticize the monarchy. Louis tries to shut them down. The liberals use that as pretext for a popular uprising. And combining the liberal politicians with the working class strength of the French workers barricading the streets of Paris, we have revolution once again. For the third time since 1789, forces will take to the streets, to the barricades, and they will force the abdication of a monarchy. This time, Louis Philippe, who will go and live the rest of his life in England. Yes. So that's how we get there. So when the revolution occurs, liberal leaders who had instigated the revolution of 1848 in Paris are going to call for, typical liberal things. Greater representation in government, the guarantees of civil liberties, laissez-faire economic policies, blah, 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 blah. We've heard all these demands over and over out of French liberal types. But they are going to use the workers as their muscle in the streets. It is the working class demonstrations and barricades and violence, if we're being honest, that allow for these liberal politicians to get into a position of power anyway. This time, the workers are not going to accept just basic liberal reform as the goal of the revolution. They are going to call for an addressing of the social question. For those who don't remember, the social question is, what do we do about the inequality economically that capitalism, that industrialization is causing? Are we going to address these concerns at all? And so one of the things that the workers are going to force the government to do is create these national workshops, which are basically what today we might call like welfare. It is basically guaranteeing a right to work, that a worker who can't find work through the private sector can go to these government workshops and work on various projects that produce goods for, public use and is paid for by public monies. Now, the enemies of these workshops are going to misrepresent them and make them into like basically free money for the workers who are being lazy, and it is going to be very unpopular. And what we are going to see is that the leaders of the revolution are going to call a vote to elect a new government. What we're going to see is that they're going to create a republic. Now, the working class wants to hold off on the vote because they don't believe that their message has gotten out, and that the vast majority of the people, unfamiliar with democratic rule, will vote for officials who don't have their best interests in mind. This is an age-old conundrum in democracies where many times people feel that the lower classes or the less politically astute tend to vote the opposite of what is actually in their own economic interest. And so the working class is very worried about this. The vote is held and their fears turn out to come true, which is a conservative government is going to be formed under the Second Republic that is going to protect conservative landholders, property holders. There's not going to be widespread social change and the addressing of social inequality. And this is sealed when the election of Louis Napoleon is going to take place, and he will be the president, the Prince President, as he's often called, of the Second Republic. Now, if that name sounds familiar, yes, that is the nephew of the Napoleon. And just like Napoleon, he is going to use democracy to come to power and then transform the government into a dictatorship. So the Constitution of 1848 basically calls for a president to serve a four-year term. There is no re-election of that presidency. Louis Napoleon is going to take advantage of the turmoil of the time. He's going to say that he represents the true interests of the people as opposed to the legislative assembly. And he is going to launch a coup where he seizes power, and then he is going to present a constitution which would transform him into an emperor, Napoleon III, and it will pass overwhelmingly with the French people. Does this sound familiar at all? Basically, a Bonaparte has used democracy to come to power and then presented an option to the people that vote him into having absolute power. And so within 4 years, the Second Republic is born, I guess, lives, and then dies and becomes the Second French Empire. And so for the second time in 50 years, attempts at Republican government have transformed into what Kagan will call Caesarism, what we can call dictatorship. And that is the revolution in France, basically. We see a popular uprising lead to the formation of a republic, but that republic falters and becomes a dictatorship. And Napoleon III, or Louis Napoleon, will be the decisive political figure in France over the next 2 decades. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but this is just so unbelievable to say. Louis Napoleon III, who actually lived in America for a while before he went back to France and became the emperor, is going to rule until he is captured in battle by the Prussian forces during the Franco-Prussian War, which it just shows you how much war has changed in like a century and a half. Could you imagine an American president being captured on the battlefield by the enemy and held as ransom today? It's incongruous. But anyway, that's that. All right, so just like in 1830, hold on a second, there's one more topic we have to talk about, I see. During the Revolution of 1848, women will seek to make gains through the turmoil that's happening as well. We'll see the formation of 2 groups in France. There's many more than this. One represents radical French feminism. The other represents the more traditional feminism that we have seen be attempted in European history up to this point. Neither of them will be successful. The Vesuvians, who name themselves after Mount Vesuvius, famous Roman volcano that erupted and destroyed Pompeii, they are going to call for women's equality completely equal to men, and they want it right now. They're going to make many demands. They are going to appear very radical, and they're going to freak out a lot of conservative type peoples in French society who are turned off by their radical style, radical message, radical policies. The Voix des Femmes, that is terrible French, the women's voice basically, is going to be a periodical, like a magazine, that is going to argue that, you know, women are important parts of society and they should be educated. It's kind of the Christine de Pizan argument as well. But despite their more eloquent and mainstream calls for reform, they will be discarded and ignored as usual. So once again, in a major event in European history, women will seek to participate and make gains, and they will find themselves stymied by the powers that be. Okay. Now, just like in 1830, violence inside of France is going to reverberate and move into other parts of Europe. And where we are going to see the French Revolution of 1848 have the biggest impact is within the Austrian Empire. The Habsburgs are incredibly vulnerable to revolution in 1848. Why is that, you ask? Well, number one, they have a very conservative regime, right? Unlike France, which had tinkered with liberal reforms since 1789, and the British government, who always slowly implements reforms to prevent revolution from taking place, the conservative governments of Central and Eastern Europe were very conservative and allowed for very little political reform. Just think of Russia's reaction to the Decembrist revolt in 1825. A liberalized army unit attempts to push for liberal reform, and it results in repression and even greater conservative control than before. So the Habsburgs had not allowed for any sort of liberal reform to take place within their society, and so they were very anti-liberal. Number two, the Austrian Empire is beset with nationalist problems. There are many different groups of people within the borders of the German Austrian rulers, and they are going to each seek out their own little niche of autonomy, which imperils the Habsburgs' claim to authority and legitimacy. And so they're going to be very vulnerable to nationalism. Showing the conservative nature of society, they still have serfdom in most of their societies, which is a huge problem that needs to be addressed and dealt with. And all these things combined are going to make them very vulnerable to the revolutions that break out. Now, the one thing that's going to save the Habsburgs, well, there's really two things. Number one, the conservative government that's in charge is going to be shaken by the revolutions at first. It catches them unprepared, and they're unwilling to use force to stop them at first. But later, they're not going to have much of a problem with using their militaries to crush the popular uprisings that take place, and they will be very successful. And then secondly, the actual diversity of the Austrian Empire saves it, because when one group asks for special treatment, all the other groups feel imperiled by that new group getting special treatment. And so they will often side with the Austrians instead of their comrades in arms, if you will, their oppressed minority groups. And so the different groups within the empire have different goals and desires, and that's going to lead to them being sort of isolated and dealt with one by one, as we shall see. Okay, so let's talk about what happens. So basically, the French Revolution in 1848 sends shockwaves throughout all of Europe. Viennese students and liberal types in the city of Vienna hear about what happens in France, and they take to the streets and they shake the foundations of the Habsburg Empire. And this movement in Vienna is going to inspire movements elsewhere. And the first real person to join in here is going to be the Hungarians, right? Now, real quickly, when the Vienna uprising happens, the Habsburgs are going to sneak away in the middle of the night, basically, and abandon the city to the protesters. One of the things that the Austrian emperor is going to do is he's going to abolish serfdom. They don't want the popular uprising in the cities of the Habsburg Empire to move to the countryside. The serfs are much more of a threat to the long-term stability of the Austrians than some workers in these cities. And so the emperor abolishes serfdom, removing the serfs as a source of revolutionary fire. And this is going to be the biggest long-lasting impact the revolutions of 1848 have, because they result in no real political changes. Okay, now the Hungarians see what's going on in Vienna and they say, ooh, now's the time to act. Let's force some demands from the Habsburgs. And basically, what the Hungarians want is liberal reforms in a constitution. They want guarantees of like equality of religion, jury trials, election of lower chamber of a legislative assembly that represents their interests, the creation of a free press, nobles having to pay their fair share of taxes, local autonomy within a shared emperor. Basically, what the Hungarians are going to ask for is, we want our own ministers, Hungarian ministers who rule over the Hungarian territory, which is autonomous within the Austrian Empire. We will share an emperor. The Emperor of Austria is our emperor, but everything else we will do our own thing. We'll have our own military, our own legislative assemblies, our own autonomy within the larger Austrian Empire. Now, of course, the problem with this from an Austrian viewpoint is if you allow this for the Hungarians, every single other group is going to ask for it too. So that is bad for the Austrians. But they're not really in a position where they can resist these demands at first. Now, the problem the Hungarians run into is that the area that they live, Hungary, does not just include Hungarians. They are maybe 40% of the population of that territory. There is a hodgepodge of other groups as well. There are Romanians and Bulgarians and other groups of people as well. And they don't like this idea about Magyarization. Magyar is the Hungarian word for Hungarian. And so when the Hungarians are leading the revolution, basically what they want to do is create a Hungarian state within the Austrian state where Hungarian culture will be the number one and only and official. And they are going to say to the other members of the Hungarian state that are not Hungarian, it's cool. Just learn to speak Hungarian and practice Hungarian culture, and you'll be treated the same as anyone else. Basically, the Magyars are going to tell non-Magyars, be a Magyar, and you'll be treated fine. If you refuse, well, you'll be a second-class citizen. Now, obviously, the non-Hungarian peoples living in Hungary are going to feel threatened by this. And so when the Austrian army begins to march on the Hungarian army, they are going to pull in resources and troops from Croatia and Italy and all these other places who are opposed to Hungarian independence, because they basically feel their national identity, their cultural identity would be better protected by the German-speaking Austrians than by the Hungarians. And so what is the result of the Hungarian uprising? The Magyars are crushed. The Austrian army comes in and puts them down. Russia has a little bit of a hat tip here. They are going to commit 200,000 troops and help quell this rebellion. And all the Hungarian goals are going to be for naught. So for those of you who are thinking like, aha, now we become the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The end of the revolution of 1848 is the crushing of the Hungarian uprising and no special treatment for the Hungarians whatsoever. Now, obviously, this Hungarian nationalist issue is going to continue to plague the Habsburgs, but we'll get to that later on. Same thing is going to happen in other parts of the Habsburg Empire. In Bohemia, where there is a Czech population, they are going to be inspired by what they see the Hungarians do, and they're going to say, hey, if the Hungarians get their own autonomy within the Austrian Empire, we want the same for the Czechs. Now, this Czech nationalism problem, which is going to flourish in Prague, is going to draw the opposition of German-speaking peoples who live in Bohemia, who are going to say, yeah, no, we don't want to be a German minority in a Czech state within the Austrian Empire. So we're going to support the Austrians in crushing this as well. And that is exactly what will happen. Now, this concept of pan-Slavism, this idea that Slavic peoples need their own state, never realized, but is going to be an influential thing on Eastern European politics. Russia is going to play off of this pan-Slavism. They're Slavic peoples. They're going to promote themselves as the protector of Slavic interests. And Slavic nationalism is going to be a thorn in the side for the Habsburgs up until the outbreak of World War I. So what happens in the Bohemia region of Austria during the revolutions of 1848? Popular uprising, government capitulation at first, and then a regrouping and a crushing of the forces once again by the Habsburgs. And I haven't really addressed this yet, but just like in Hungary, where the leaders of the revolution create enemies, we're going to see the same thing play out in the revolutions of 1848. Liberal politicians will lead the political maneuver, but they'll rely on the street demonstrations of the working class. And all of a sudden, when they have success and they push the conservatives out, they realize that their goals are incompatible. The liberal reformers do not want to make socialist style economic and social reforms, and so they lose the support of their muscle, the street demonstrators, the working class, and then they are easily conquered by a reinvigorated conservative order. Lather, rinse, repeat. It's going to happen over and over again. Italy. Italy is not a unified state at this time. There are 5 Italian states, and they are basically controlled by the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs control northern Italy. Piedmont is the largest independent Italian state. They are going to try and take advantage of the chaos of 1848 and lead a revolution that will create Italian unification led by Piedmont. But every time Piedmont's military goes into battle against Austrian forces, they lose. The Pope is going to get dragged into this. There is a Pope who has appointed a liberal ministry in his papal states, which is a country, a nation, headquartered in Rome. And many revolutionaries are going to flock to Rome thinking that the Pope is an ally. They will press upon him through popular uprisings and demonstration in Roman streets, trying to force him to appoint a radical ministry that pushes for a republican form of government and complete freedom from the Habsburgs. Pius IX, the Pope who is doing these things, doesn't like that. He actually flees and goes into exile, running away from his own Italian supporters. Piedmont jumps in the battle again, gets beat down again by the Austrians. And then France jumps in the fray, not on the side of the Romans, but on the side of the Habsburgs, basically, crushes the Romantic Republicans inside of Italy, and puts the Pope back on his throne and stays there until 1870-ish, and says that they are the personal protector of the Pope. So basically, we have a revolution in Italy. They call for unification of the Italian peninsula and a republican form of government. And stop me if you've heard this before. Popular uprisings result in initial success. And then the conservative forces that had been in control, they sort of rebound, come back with excessive force and crush the protests. And then last but not least, the German states. So in the German states, liberal Germans had called for unification for a long time, but had always found themselves stymied by the status quo in the German states. Well, they used the revolutions of 1848 to do two things. Number one, uprisings in Berlin will compel the Prussian emperor to make some concessions. He doesn't want to turn his army on his own people, and so he promises to make a constitution. At first, he appoints a liberal ministry to do this, but then he gets tired of it and says, forget you guys, I'm just going to make my own constitution. He makes a very conservative constitution that allows for universal male suffrage. And this is the beginning of a trend that we're going to see more in the next chapter that we look at, is that conservative politicians after 1848, they completely destroy liberalism as a threat to their power. They're going to begin to very carefully and selectively pick ideas that liberals had promoted. One of those, universal male suffrage. The thought process is, we can get the working class a vote, and by carefully crafting our message, we can ensure that they vote for us, even though it may not be in their own economic interest to do so. And so we are going to see universal male suffrage given in Prussia, but it is going to be heavily restricted. They will divide the Prussian state into three social classes based on wealth, and the top 5% of the wealthy people elect 33% of the legislative assembly's representation. So the rich are going to dominate this new system, but this will be the Prussian system up until World War I, and when Germany unifies under Prussian leadership, that's the way that legislative assemblies in Germany will be voted for. Now, a group of liberals meet in the German city of Frankfurt, and they are hell-bent on creating a liberal constitution that creates a unified German state. And so they will meet over the course of a year. It's a debacle from the start. They're supposed to have the support of the working class, but there is a working class uprising in the city when they are negotiating, and they call in military forces to dispel their own supporters. Workers finally realize that these liberal politicians are never going to have their interests in heart. They want an addressing of the social conditions, and liberal politicians are laissez-faire, free market sort of peeps who are just not going to embrace the lower classes. They'll be more than happy to use their violent upheavals, but they will never enact policies to help them. And so liberals are met with a death knell at the Revolution of 1848 because they're shut off from the source of support that would have helped them achieve their goals, the working class urban populations. Well, anyway, Frankfurt, the parliament there finally makes a constitution. It calls for a liberal constitution and a unified German state led by the Prussian emperor. They present the constitution to the Prussian emperor. They say, here, Prussian emperor, you are now the German empire, or German emperor. What do you think about that? That's a great position. You're going to have tons of power. And the Prussian empire is like, yeah, no thanks. I am not going to become a ruler of a united Germany because you guys gave the power to me. That totally violates all my feelings about monarchy and legitimacy. So thanks for meeting. I'm not going to pay any attention to this constitution. It has no legal validity. And now I'm going to call in the army and they're going to disperse you. And that's what happens. I know these things are a little complicated. The good news is there's never been many questions about the revolutions of 1848 on an AP exam. And I think the key takeaway here is really what you need to know. These revolutions start with great fanfare and hope. There is a lot of success early on because these liberal politicians and the urban working class coalition looks really strong. And these conservative governments are caught by surprise. And they don't use force and they capitulate and they start to give in and allow for some negotiations and some changes. This is why it's called the spring times of the people. But basically what we see is that once the conservative government is sort of knocked back, the fissures between the liberals and the working class are exposed, and the conservatives are kind of looking like, these guys are not nearly as strong as we thought they were. They are very vulnerable. And in fact, I don't see this political alliance lasting very long. And it never does. And then throw in the complicating matter of nationalism and the Hungarians alienating all the other nationalist groups with their own goals for Magyarization. And the alliances that would have allowed for success to happen are fractured permanently. And so the conservative regimes see this, they come back with their militaries, they still have monopoly on military firepower, and they basically lay siege to their cities, and they besiege their own citizens into surrender and submission. And so the Habsburg military will undo all of the revolutions that take place in their cities all throughout their empire, and none of the goals will accomplish anything that was that had seemed possible just 6 months earlier. And so by 1849, by 1850, all the revolutions have failed. They become minor footnotes in history. You've probably never heard of them. I had never really heard about them until I started teaching this class, and they have very little impact going forward, as we shall see. And so the great hopes of liberalism dashed. And really, that's the end of liberalism as a political force until really we get to, I don't know, World War I. You will see some of the goals of liberals be achieved in the second half of the 19th century. Almost every European nation will have full male suffrage, but they will all be enacted by conservative governments. How do we get there? That's what chapter 14 is about. That's it for now. I will probably make another video tomorrow for you guys about the beginnings of chapter 14. If you got any questions or concerns, you can hit me up in the comments or email me. Let me know how these things are playing out. I'll see you guys soon.